Welcome to Decision Space, the only podcast that takes place right here between the turns between your favorite games. Oh!
Well, it was going so good.
It was so good. Okay. Welcome to Decision Space, the only podcast that takes place right here in between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan.
And I'm Jake.
And we're so excited to have you here for another episode of Decision Space. This week, a Where is What We Talk About episode, not a Where Is My Mind episode, though we will have a Where Is My Mind segment, but a What We Talk About episode about mistakes. Jake, how are you doing today?
Good. Like you said, I'm excited. We're just a couple of excited guys here, ready to talk some board games. Like, I feel like we always start out like, we're so excited, but it's kind of true.
It is kind of true. And it's nice because, you know, we're 21 episodes in now. The listeners don't know this, but I'm going to tell them now. We recorded the Carcassonne episode like 4 days ago. So normally we try to have a full week between our recordings, and for whatever reason we got pinched on both sides. And I'm just as excited as I am when we go like a full week waiting to record. I'm like, I've been anxious for this conversation and looking forward to it. So that's a good place to be. And I hope you all are too, though it will be a full week for you.
Yeah. And the What We Talk About episodes are always I think probably some of the most fun ones we do. So hopefully this will be another one that people enjoy. Let's
Definitely.
get into it.
Awesome. So we talked about doing a Where's My Mind segment for a long time. This was like an introductory short, like, what are you thinking about in terms of gaming or something? And we promised we were going to do it every episode. And then we promptly realized we talk too much about our core subjects. But I think when we have these What We Talk Abouts, periodically we'll go back to them. And I know Jake has some things on his mind. So do you want to jump in and let us know where in the space you're existing? Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is just a segment that we always do some of the time. Yeah, so I got to play a game of Dune Imperium. It was really fun. Jamie Stegmaier came over and taught the game. Played with him and another mutual friend, Miles, who did some of the art in the new Stonemaier game, Red Rising. And we had a great time with it. So I just thought I'll use this platform to do a little mini review of Dune Imperium.
Awesome. Can I ask before you dive into it, what were you expecting going into Dune Imperium? Did you expect to enjoy it? Were you excited to play it? Were you middle of the road? Where were you at with it?
Definitely excited to play it. Jamie's been talking about it a lot. I believe it was his number one game of last year.
Wow.
And I've talked about how I've been very lukewarm to just cold on deck building games in general. Not something that I'm typically drawn to, but I had such a good time playing Arnak, which has the deck building combined with worker placement vibe, which is repeated in Dune Imperium, that I was excited to try another game in that sort of mold.
Yeah.
And have that as a point of comparison.
Nice. So what do you think of it?
So I had a great time with it. And my overall takeaway is that I think this trend of deck building combined with worker placement works really well. I think I enjoy Dune Imperium and Arnak both more than any other deck building game I've played previously. It's hard to put my finger on exactly why, but I think those two system mechanics combine in a way that really creates a rich texture to make decisions and some very rewarding gameplay.
Would you say that so in Arnak, we talked a lot how like there's equal parts deck building, equal parts worker placement, and then like a track that sort of plays equal roles. Would you say Dune Imperium is weighted more towards like deck building or the worker placement, or is it fairly even?
I'd say it's pretty even, which means it's more weighted towards deck building than Arnak is, where
Sure.
I would say in Arnak, the deck building almost takes a backseat to the action selection and worker placement that's happening in other portions of the game. And it's more traditional in the way the deck building is set up. You just have a standard market. When a card is bought, it's replaced. They all have a cost. And then when you buy a card, it's added to your discard pile and then will be randomly shuffled back into your deck. So in Arnak, you can kind of plan it's almost exactly when you'll get a card. Where in Dune Imperium, if you buy a card that you'll eventually see it as you draw through your deck, but you're not necessarily going to be able to build and construct combos in the exact same way because the cards might simply not come up together, which I think does add some interesting constraints. Maybe you want to think a lot harder about buying a card just because it's good if it doesn't fit in with what you're trying to do. That said, I like the deck building. I still am not crazy about deck building in general. So overall, that compares for me less favorably than Arnak. That was probably one area that I really preferred Arnak. But the cards were really cool and facilitated some really interesting interaction on the board. And I think that's the biggest the biggest pro in favor of Dune Imperium, is that the player interaction is much stronger. And the way the game works is each round, there's essentially a one single combat that happens at the end of each round after everybody's passed, taking their actions, if you choose to enter the combat. And that's where a lot of the points are generated from. And it's a game to 10 victory points. So that mechanism really funnels kind of everything you're doing towards that combat that makes interaction between players really rich. And there's intrigue cards you can get to kind of increase your powers at the last seconds, or maybe retreat from the combat if you realize you're going to lose, which almost gives it, we talked about at the table, that almost has that Magic the Gathering double think vibe, where you can put one person into the combat as just sort of a misdirection, and there's a big element of bluffing and double think between kind of these instant effects that can take place. So that was really fun. And then the last thing I'll say about it, just as a final point of comparison, is I felt like the decision space in Dune Imperium was much bigger, significantly more open. Not only are there just way more spaces you can go to, but it's also, and maybe this would change with more plays, a lot harder to easily decipher where one space is good for you and another is not. It almost, in Arnak, it's very clear, I need this resource so I can go to this space. And there's a little bit of that in Dune Imperium, but much less. So it gave the feeling of much more viable actions on any given turn. So it just really blew up the decision space. And then when you factor in how important that interaction is between players, and what are other people doing? What are they angling for? It really created like a massive decision space that made the game feel, very cloudy in a way that Arnak is not. It was really hard to tell on any turn if what I was doing was optimal or bad. And then, all the way down to the end of the game, when I ended up coming in third out of 3 players, it was revealed at that point that clearly I was making some bad choices throughout the game, but I just couldn't really, with the exception of a couple of things I couldn't tell you now, these were the moments that I made a mistake. I should have gone to this space, or I should have took this card. So it was really cloudy. And I think that also speaks to a lot of replayability, right? I think that the learning would be slow, so you would probably get a lot of plays out of it as you are slowly improving. And I think that's a lot of people's bag. If you really enjoy area control games, I think it has a very similar vibe to something like Blood Rage, in that sense that things are very cloudy. That's not necessarily my bag. So out of the 2 games, I think Arnak is the one that appeals more to my sensibilities as a gamer. But I think Dune Imperium is fantastic. I would love to play it again. And, it's definitely one I would recommend if anything I've said here sounds like something that you enjoy in games.
Yeah, no, that sounds very interesting. And especially the bluffing component. There's just basically, if you made such a strong comparison to Arnak, and I think that's really fair, and there's just nothing like that really in Arnak. They're so that it's so interesting that these two games came out at the same time and sort of coexist and have such a similar suite of mechanics but play so differently. Dune Imperium is definitely one I would love to try at some point too, just because everyone seems like they're so high on it. And does Dune Imperium go up to 5 players or is it 2 to 4?
I think it goes up to 4. I don't know for sure, but I will say that Jamie and Miles both preferred Dune Imperium to Arnak, and I know the same is true with our other friend Paul Solomon. He also preferred Dune Imperium, so I'm certainly, at least in my play group, in the minority for preferring Arnak. So it's a great game, and I think what you're saying, how different the two games play, yet sharing so much DNA in terms of mechanism, shows that this is still, even though we have these two games that came out simultaneously, I hope people keep exploring this sort of mashup of mechanisms, because I think there is, certainly there could be a game more of a middle point, and I think there could be a game, on further to each end of the spectrum. There's just a lot of, I think, richness there to explore.
I'm really curious if someone's ever going to make a game. So both of these games, you have deck builders giving you inputs for worker placement in some ways. And I obviously I haven't fully thought through this, but it'd be really interesting if you had a game where you took your worker placement actions first and those played into the functioning of building your deck. So like instead of sort of like phase 2 being worker placement, phase 1 is worker placement and phase 2 is deck building. And I don't know how much you could like play with that inversion, but it could be interesting.
Is there anything on your mind this week?
There is. So my wife, Maya, and I are going for the first time in ages on a vacation, almost like 2 years. We're going to the beach, just to a friend's cabin for a few days, which created the opportunity to sort of have the discussion of what games do we want to bring. And it was very interesting because the games that I always love when I get to have those discussions with Maya because we have sort of similar tastes as game playing people. And I wasn't sure how it was going to trend. We're also meeting her sister and our nephew are going to be there and my brother-in-law. So excited to see family too. And a lot of the games that came up as games that we wanted to play, normally I went to all of the classics that we might normally bring and I pulled out like Railroad Inc. and just a lot of other sort of roll and write games. And Maya was like, no, we need to play like on the table interactive games where we're all like sharing in this space and like none of this own personal play stuff. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And then also Rummy Cub made it out, which I guess is sort of what she was describing. But Rummy Cub's just like a family favorite of Maya and her sister. So I think we're going to be playing like lots of more classic leaning games. I also, I threw Carcassonne in. We've never, with this group, played Carcassonne, and I'm not sure my brother and sister-in-law have ever played it. They love playing games with us, but they're not necessarily like board gaming isn't their hobby. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. And then also, I threw in Hey, That's My Fish, because I think that's just going to be sort of like the perfect light game to jump back into things and just like a classic deck of cards too. But it was fun. That ritual is really enjoyable, and I haven't been able to partake in it in a long time.
Is there one game you're most excited to play?
I think it's Hey, That's My Fish. It's been so fun. And it's such a good, Hey, That's My Fish it's so easy to teach and it's so intuitive that I think, and it's so quick to play that I could see it being the game if everyone enjoys the first play that we just play like that game all weekend in some ways.
I love that game. It's also the only game I can think of where like the title is literally the table talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could picture somebody sitting there in like a play test, just like write them that note and like, I've got it.
Right. Totally. Someone shouted, Hey, that's my fish. And that was the title. Yeah. Definitely. I think too, if as a listener, you're thinking, why did Jake and Brendan keep talking about, Hey, that's my fish? I think you're going to just have to deal with it. I think we'll find another way to integrate Hey, that's my fish into an episode in some way, shape, or form more earnestly in the future.
Yeah, let's do a feature episode on it. I think it could hold up to that.
I think so. The more we play it, like the more I feel like it's getting there in terms of, But okay, main topic.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool, let's do it. So do you want to sort of give the intro for this week's topic, actually, Jake?
Sure. So this week we are talking about what we talk about when we talk about mistakes in board games. And caged in that is this question that Brendan brought up on our last episode on Carcassonne. If you haven't listened to that, maybe go back and check it out. where he was talking about choices versus decisions. And as we all know, games provide lots of choices, but in many ways, those choices are tiered. Some are better than others, and some may not be viable at all. So Brendan posed the question, maybe what a mistake is in a board game is when you make a choice that is not actually a decision. So today on this episode, we are going to tease out all of that. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think so too. And just to extrapolate on what Jake was saying, the reason why the reason why a decision ends up being a decision and why a choice might not actually be a decision is in part because we were sort of contextualizing choices as options the game presents you that don't advance you meaningfully towards winning. Whereas decisions are two choices that you could make that you're picking between that you are maybe unsure of which is the better decision in terms of how far or it will advance you towards winning. And so much of that is sort of like nebulous thinking about games that it's hard to sort of put numbers behind, right? And that's sort of parsing, trying to make decisions in games. Do I want to take this choice, which seems like it's going to lead to this point payout and might accomplish this in terms of blocking my opponent? Or do I want to take choice B, knowing that it might pay out even more, but might pay out none? And that's really where you're making those meaty decisions. Whereas a choice might be, you could put your piece over here, but it's just strictly worse in terms of point outcome or blocking your opponent to decision A or B. And
Yeah, I would say like a lot of games give you the option of passing. So you could pass on your first turn before doing anything else. That is a choice you could make, but clearly not optimal in almost all cases.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think also it's I'm glad you pulled that out because there's certainly the possibility of confusing people when we use the term choice and decision. You're probably listening, you're like, well, if I decide to do something wrong, like I've still made that decision. And I think the reason we're using that framework is because of our definition of decision space, where when we're talking about decision space in board games, we're thinking only about viable decisions because all of the choices that you can make that are without value are not viable in any way. That doesn't really come into your mind, my mind, and I think I'm speaking for you as well, when we're thinking through what we want to do on a given turn.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like in a large part, we got to this conversation, this idea for talking about mistakes, because through this framework, we sort of realized that a lot of times when you make a mistake in a board game, you are picking a choice that you think is a viable decision, when at the end of the game, the feedback that the game has given you and hindsight of that choice not playing out might make you realize that the choice that you went with wasn't actually a viable decision strategically or tactically at that point in the game. So the mistake enabling the learning, and obviously we don't choose to make mistakes. So they play into, well, they either play into our inability of knowing if that decision is right or not, or if it's a game with like prowess or like what am I trying to think of, Jake? Like a lot of sports is just performing at a specific task, and a lot of games will have that too, like fighting games where your technical ability to perform a specific task, that's skill testing, which is a little bit different than a lot of times the decisions we're talking about. Which is go for it.
Yeah, and I think to sort of round out this intro to this discussion, I think the ability to make a mistake, to choose something that is not viable, is in many ways something that is necessary for a game to be a game at all. Sometimes a really cloudy game, like I was talking about Dune Imperium, it feels like all the choices are equally viable when you're just learning it, and that makes the decision space feel really big, but you still know that certain things are better than others, right? You could make a better decision or a worse one for that turn, and that's what makes games fun. You know, if we had a toy game, I invented a toy game for this episode, Brendan. This is
amazing.
My first one.
I'm so excited.
It's called Red versus Blue.
Okay.
And in this game, you have a red D6 and a blue D6.
Okay.
And on your turn, you get to choose red or blue.
Nice.
If I choose red on my turn, I roll the red die, and you have to roll the blue die.
and the higher value wins.
Higher, that gets a point, and then we switch. Yeah.
Nice.
So that is a game where you have two equally viable choices, right?
Yep. But interestingly, no decision really.
Well, you get to choose, right? So exactly. So that's my point. If you can't make a bad choice, if there's no difference in the viability, the percent chance that you've made the right choice, then you don't have a game at all.
I think that that's such a good toy game, Jake, because it illustrates that you can have two equally viable choices and still have no decision, because the consequences on the outcome don't matter at all. So that was awesome. And I'm so glad that you've brought a toy game to the table. And listeners, if you don't know what we mean by toy game, this is an idea that Richard Garfield came up with, and it's a game to illustrate a sort of game design point. It's not really a game that you would actually play. So don't think that Jake's going to, meet up with you at Gen Con in a few years and try to play Red versus Blue.
Yeah, catch me in the prototype room.
Wait, what do you mean, Mayfair? Why don't you want to publish this? It's brilliant. But I felt like it would be good in terms of understanding and sort of thinking about how people talk about mistakes in the context of other games that don't necessarily fall into the world of board games, and sort of see what we can glean from that and then bring it back to the conversation of board games. So in classic Decision Space fashion, the first place that I've gone is chess. And chess is really interesting because chess, when you play sort of on a chess app, like the chess.com app, the computers will give you an output of your choices at the end of the game, where they will rate you in terms of how accurate your decisions were. And so did you have inaccuracies? I'll talk about what that means. Did you make any mistakes? And did you make any blunders? And obviously a blunder is also just like culturally a word that is highly associated with chess. And you intuitively, I think we all know, oh, you made a blunder. Like, it's just a word. We know what that means. But I really wanted to look at when people say someone blundered in chess, what are they specifically talking about? And so I think it probably makes sense not to start with blunders, though, and go back to inaccuracies. So inaccuracies are a way to describe when you don't make the best move in the position, but it doesn't change the current game state. In terms of your odds of your winning, it doesn't shift the position. So if you're in a winning position and you make an inaccuracy, you might move a game that you were going to win in 4 turns to a game that you can win in 10 turns, but you haven't meaningfully given up your advantage outside of time. So you haven't taken a winning position and made it even, or you haven't taken a winning position and made it even slightly less winning, maybe a little bit, but not in a huge way.
Can we say an inaccuracy is making a good move instead of the best move?
I think that that's pretty much what an inaccuracy is getting at. Yeah. And a lot of times in games with grandmasters, the way in which people gain an advantage is just by making fewer inaccuracies, because mistakes and blunders aren't happening. So you basically, two people try to have, you might have like, in grandmaster games, like 99% accuracy for both of the players, where they're making objectively, according to the computer, the best move in any given situation. And they really find those edge just by finding that little bit of weakness in you took a slightly worse decision, but still a good move. Yeah. And then mistakes. Mistakes are moves that make the current task, so what your opponent is trying to do, easier or a lot easier. So basically, if you were winning, it might mean that you could slip your winning and your position as winning the game to being more even. You've given up a piece of your advantage, but it's a slight edge. You haven't given the game away. You haven't given up a piece for no trade, maybe, but maybe you've traded down in your piece, or you've given up a meaningful shift in tempo, or you've lost a defender of one of your pieces that's going to set you back and weaken your overall plan.
So this, for the lay person definition, is a bad move.
Definitely a bad move. A move that meaningfully does weaken your chances of winning.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the language that we should look to throughout the conversation of mistakes are decisions that you make that meaningfully reduce your chance of winning in a game.
So I think that's interesting. Trying to fit it in with our initial framework, would you say a mistake is a player making a choice, right, when they could have made a decision? Or is it, a decision could be, something like this is like a 1% the best move, right? So it's still like that could have some value to it, because I think when we're talking about choices, we're talking about things that have 0% chance of being right. Or is this just a mistake falls squarely into that, making a choice when you could have made a decision?
That's really interesting. And I think is hard in the context of chess when we're trying to then take the lessons here and apply them to board games, because chess is a game of without randomness outside of your opponent's, the behavior of your opponent, right? So I think in a board game, you might be offered so much of what we're going to be talking about is tough because I don't want to just talk about like probabilities and abstract things. But to your point, Jake, maybe you have a choice that's a 1 out of 99% chance of you winning. So it's going to pay out in this huge point outcome, but it's very unlikely. That might still be a viable decision that you can make, especially if you could shift the game state towards that happening. But you might have another choice that when you make that choice, the plan is much more likely to succeed. Maybe it succeeds 90% of the time rather than 1% of the time. But your chance of winning when you make that choice maybe only goes up a little bit.
How about poker, right? Okay. Maybe it would be a situation where you make a big bet and your only way of winning is if you get, 2 specific cards on the turn and river.
Yep.
Right. So that could be like a less than 1% chance of that happening. Yet there's a chance where the optimal move in that situation is to fold.
Fold. Sure. Yeah. And I feel like in terms of poker, I feel like a lot of the common thinking is like, oh, you should just fold there. Just when you play poker, play the odds. But it's interesting in terms of decisions versus choices. Is it a choice? Is a 1 in 99%, is a 1% chance outcome of winning? Does that count? I guess it depends on the game and depends on the player, but 99% of the time it will be a mistake.
Right. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then I guess finally, just to cap it off, a blunder is just a move essentially that dramatically alters the position. You were winning, you made a blunder, and now if you're not even, you might be losing a little bit. It's something that has significantly compromised your ability to win or significantly compromised your position in the game. So you could be really, really winning and blunder and then bring your opponent back into the game, or it could be a draw and you could blunder and you could basically give the game away.
Yeah. In competitive card game circles, I think a lot of times people talk about a blunder as a throw.
Yeah,
like have your last round go, oh, I threw because I did X, Y, and Z, and that was obviously wrong.
Totally. Which definitely, it's so interesting, sort of the language that gets used in different games. And I do wonder if in some ways it has to do with the amount of agency that you have, where sometimes in fighting games, it's like, oh, I just like totally threw, when you make a series of really bad decisions. And in fighting games, because all options are viable sometimes, every choice that you can make is probably a decision, but it's similar to poker in that there's certain behavior that you can take that's so risky, you would be Yeah. I
would say not all fight. In Smash Bros, for example, you could SD, right? Jump off the stage on accident, and that would be a blunder. There's no value to you doing that at all. It's something that happens at the top level of play. And it fundamentally changes the trajectory of that game when it does.
And I feel like that in SD and sort of jumping off the stage in Smash, where your opponent did nothing to force you off and you just gave up a stock, kind of ties into how people talk about mistakes in sports. So I won't dwell on the sports example for very long, but in baseball statistics, baseball statistics are used to look at how teams perform. And it's interesting because one thing that people care about is when a batter goes to bat and they hit the ball and they make it to a base, did they make it to the base because they hit the ball well, or did they make it to the base because a fielder didn't do their job as perceived as well as they should do it? Meaning, did they make it to first base because the fielder made a mistake, or did they make it because it was a good hit? And there's some subjectivity there, but when a batter hits the ball and makes it to first base and they should have been out, that is ruled an error, right? So like maybe the person who's fielding the ball just throws it wildly over the first baseman's head, or they fumble the ball in some way and they make it. That is a situation where they don't get credit for the hit. Instead, the defender gets marked for an error. So it's just a way to think through sort of, this plays into expectations, which I think is interesting. An error comes into play when in a given situation in a game, based on the information that you had, the expectation is that you should be able to perform in a certain way. And if that doesn't go well, then it's an error. And I think that sometimes in board games, we talked about this a little bit in Carcassonne, actually, Jake. The example of when a player wants to put a tile somewhere to complete the sort of the feature, like you want to put the middle tile of the city just because you want to finish the feature. That's an error. There's no reason in terms of advancing your play towards the end that you should be doing that behavior because it doesn't help you. And it's a mistake that you do that in terms of advancing towards winning the game.
Yeah, the baseball example is really interesting because most of the time when an error happens in that context, it's a issue with execution. Right?
Yeah,
it's not like it could happen that the player makes the wrong decision, right? They field the ball and they throw it to second instead of first. Though I think that's incredibly uncommon to see something like that. More often it's as you described, right? They're trying to catch the ball correctly, but it hits their glove and bounces onto the ground. So that's an error in execution. And that doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one translation into board games, I guess outside of dexterity games, where you're doing something physically. But I think it gets closest when, and I want to talk about this a little bit later, when we're talking about mistakes made out due to lack of bandwidth, right? If you're thinking through a sequence of 10 things and you decide that's your course of action and you miscalculate on the third step and there's an issue there, right? You don't have the resources required to pay that, so you've done something totally non-optimal. I think that gets pretty close to error in execution, like you see in sports.
Definitely. And I feel like a great analog, an example of that is like the example of in KeyForge, sometimes the board states will get huge. Just you'll have 10 or 15 creatures on either side of the board, and they'll have different ability words. And maybe you'll just forget that a creature has an ability like, say, elusive. So the first time they're attacked each turn, no damage is dealt. And when you would never make the decision unless you had a meaningful follow-up to then fight into that elusive creature, and if you didn't intend to fight into it again. And there's definitely times where I've witnessed and have attacked into an elusive creature, not realizing that just because my bandwidth was overloaded. And I can say that it definitely feels a lot like dropping a fly ball in baseball.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, horrible.
It's a throw, for sure.
It's a throw, yeah.
Yeah, and that's funny. That's the exact situation example I was thinking through when I kind of came up with that. Just like, attacking an elusive creature, that's an overthrown ball for sure.
Yeah. So I think that now that we sort of have this language, and I think obviously all of these are games, but doesn't necessarily map onto board games perfectly. I feel like it might be useful to then return to that conversation we were having at the beginning of Jake. So what exactly, and I know this is what we're going to be teasing out through the course of the episode, maybe we'll just fumble our way onwards, but I think I'm curious, having talked about these things, what do we mean when we say a mistake is made in play in a board game?
Yeah, well, I think going back to the chess categories of mistakes you came up with is really helpful, because when we're talking about mistakes, I don't think we or typically people are talking about inaccuracies.
Yep.
You're generally not, with the exception of like high level competitive play. If you're playing a board game with your friends and somebody's like, oh, you made a mistake, it's generally not that somebody made a good move, but not the best move, especially because we don't have chess algorithms, determining in Dune Imperium, like what the best action placement spot is. So in most cases, that's not knowable anyway.
Yep.
I think what we're talking about when we're talking about making mistakes is taking an action that significantly worsens your chances of winning the game.
Yeah. And when we say significantly, and I think that's a big spectrum too, because I think when we say mistakes, we are including what they call blunders in chess too, right? Because you could make a mistake in a game that we would call a mistake that is like, oh, you don't have a chance of winning the game anymore. That would be a really bad mistake. But I think we could also mean something where your chances of winning the game go down 10%. And that could be a mistake, like there have definitely been times where you and I have been playing games on Yukato or Board Game Arena, and I've made a choice, and then a few turns later go, oh, I have now meaningfully affected my ability to win without sort of saying I threw the game, but I definitely have hurt myself in that. Right?
Yeah. And I mean, to pull out blunders, I think that is, for board games, the way we think about it, is more analogous to the baseball error. It's when you do something that is obviously wrong. And generally it's something I think that is pretty immediate in the feedback you get from it, right? Like in chess, it's you make a move and then the other person's like, okay, I guess I'll just take your queen. And that kind of thing happens all the time in other games. It's also the kind of thing that I think a blunder is typically something, if you're playing casually with friends, it's the kind of thing where a lot of times somebody will be like, oh, like if you want to just take that back, because it's so obviously wrong that it fundamentally almost messes up the game. And it just depends. It depends on your magic circle. I mean, most of my games aren't, with the exception of like organized competitive play, which makes up the minority of my game playing. I typically am not playing like, oh, your finger's off that piece, and now I just like win by default. Most people want to have like a fulfilling game, and I think blunders harm the whole game from that angle.
Totally. And that's what's so interesting. And I keep going back to the Carcassonne example, because in some ways, if you were playing a game competitively, and this came up in the last episode, those are moments where a player is making a choice that is so clearly within the culture of people at the table who know the game well. It's so clearly not a decision that it feels bad to allow that player to make that choice, because that the skill level at the table is at a point where culturally everyone sees that choice is so beyond not viable that we want to help the player get up to speed quicker. So to help them learn, we're just like jumping on all these concepts. We just say, no, try it again, pick a different one. Like that's not have you play out this whole game having to get that feedback. I'm just going to verbally tell you that feedback, which is really important in terms of players having a good experience together sometimes. Like not everyone should have to go through a game but games that allow you to have that can be so exciting.
For sure. And I think we should say too that can be fraught with potential pitfalls. You don't want, in order for me to want to say something, it has to be really egregious and really obvious, because that brings in almost like the alpha gamer quarterbacking problem. You want to let people, experience the game on their own and make mistakes. You don't want to take away, for you to step in and correct something in and of itself is harming the game and the magic circle. So, that what you're correcting like better be significant and worth it. And sometimes in games too, there'll be situations where, because of some hidden information, somebody does something that looks like a blunder that may not be, maybe a good move, maybe something that you haven't seen in previous plays, or perhaps they are on to something that you haven't experienced yet. So you got to be really careful, and I just wanted to put that caveat out there because I felt like we were almost coming on a little too hard. Like if somebody makes a mistake, just fix it. Not like that.
Totally. And I appreciate you making that caveat, Jake. And I feel like the other final point to it that's important is like, if you ever did that, you have to know that the person would want you to do that too. Right? Like, yeah. But it, I feel like one idea that came out of what we were talking about before the disclaimer, Jake, that was really interesting that you brought up and you mentioned to me earlier on was this idea of we've been talking about feedback some. And in terms of mistakes, one of the things that games can do most interestingly is how quickly do you get feedback that your mistake was a mistake? So the example we talked about earlier, like blunders, when they happen in chess or when they happen in KeyForge, like we were talking about, or in baseball, everyone knows the moment it happens that it was a huge mistake. But there's other mistakes that might not be huge mistakes that you don't learn about for a large period of time. So do you want to sort of maybe jump into the question that you were posing in terms of mistakes and where your head is on this sort of immediacy and the feelings that it might cause?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the general thing I was pondering is why do some mistakes in games feel so much worse than others? And I do think that immediate feedback is probably the thing that makes mistakes feel worst. But I think more specifically than that is mistakes that happen because of lack of bandwidth are the ones in particular that feel bad because the worst of all, because, and I think I hadn't thought about it until you brought up the baseball example, because it's the closest analog we have in games to an error of execution, right? Yep. There's no reason that should have happened. You know it. Everybody else at the table knows it. And so not only did you do something dumb that's hurting your chance to win the game that you're playing, but it's also embarrassing because, it was something that was easily avoidable and now it's done and you can't go back and you just have to like really grit your teeth. And I think that's the same reason it happens in chess probably most often. It's bandwidth, right? You start thinking 3-4 moves ahead that you missed the obvious one. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's so interesting that you went to embarrassment because I think it gets so much to the heart of why the mistake feels bad and also sort of partially the act of making decisions and making smart decisions being part of why we play games. And do you think, Jake, then on that spectrum, do you think that there's potential to like directly chart the amount of time and how bad between when you realize a decision is bad and how bad it feels? Or I guess it depends on how well you know the game too, which is the caveat to this entire conversation.
Yeah. I think knowing the game is important. I do think there's an interesting phenomenon that happens, if you're charting time when feedback is given over when mistake is made, that, at first it feels really bad and then it starts going down. But then I think if as time goes up more and more, as bad, it might start feeling worse again because of two reasons. One, that could be like, oh, I thought I was in this game and now all of a sudden end game scoring and I realize that I like did something that affected that. Like, that's super anticlimactic. Or I still don't know, why I've lost this game, which could be frustrating because there's, it takes so long for the game to give you feedback of a mistake you made that you probably have lost track of it and no longer are aware when it happened or what it was. So I think that could be there. I think there is, like, to your point, something interesting happening there.
And so the distance between feedback is very interesting to me too, because partially not only does it become, there's so many decisions that could have happened since then that it can be, that's partially what's clouding the feedback, right? There's all of these decisions that I've played into after that decisions that has been made that impacts your ability to go back and judge that first decision. Because so I did A, so then I did B, and then I did C. and it's tough to unravel that thread. So I feel like in some ways it cushions okay, A really was a bad decision, but I could have just changed these decisions and maybe it would have played out okay. So I feel like it just becomes easier to excuse yourself the more decisions you have between them. Now we're getting into its like player psychology, just because you can sort of say, oh, I could have salvaged that initial mistake. Right. Maybe it wasn't really a mistake. Maybe it was a 50-50 and it was just my follow-up, a 50-50 decision between two choices, 50-50 decision situation. And it was right. It wasn't that it was wrong. It's just that it didn't play out right this time. Yeah. And that's what that distance can be so hard in. And that could be true. And I think a lot of when board games are really interesting and really engaging and bring you coming back, you do have lots of sort of 50-50 or 60-40 decisions that feel very close and like judgment calls. And depending on the randomness in the game, in a different game, it might have played out okay. And it might have played out to your favor, I should say. And to me, that's where you get sort of the stubborn desire to repeat the same behavior to see if it plays out differently. And I definitely do that. I'll make a decision, end up losing the game, but I still feel like maybe it was the right decision and just the outcome of the game didn't play in my favor. So then I want to try that again. And that's where trying to understand your mistakes can become interesting and figuring out if things are mistakes.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the most important things about this conversation, mistakes aren't always bad for games, right? We sort of started off by saying they're essential for games to happen. If you can't make mistakes, if there aren't better or worse moves, then we're back to red and blue and there's no game at all. So we want there to be mistakes, but there needs for a mistake, I think, to feel satisfying, to like bring you back to the game. There has to be an area of learning, an element of learning to it, which is why, if games, the feedback is so obscured, you might not necessarily come away feeling like, okay, well, I learned this and this that I want to try next time. You might just kind of come away feeling like, I don't really know what happened in that game. I lost by a few points, but there's nothing specifically I want to try next time. Or on the other side of the spectrum, right, getting back to blunders, I think part of the reason not only are they embarrassing, they feel so bad is there's no learning there, right? If you give up your queen because you didn't realize it was pinned, or you attack into an elusive creature and waste your turn, which mess up your whole plan. Like there's no learning. It's like you already knew before that turn started that those were bad things in the game. So there's no personal benefit. You can't find anything to really take solace in.
Yeah, I feel like when I was trying to play fighting games and poking competitively, one mindset that you can get in as a player is that you start to feel like you start to see and value mistakes as being an opportunity to learn. And when you get into that mindset, making them becomes almost exciting because you realize how much better you can do in that situation in the future, right? And that's part of the excitement of playing games, is getting better and experiencing that. So as long as the mistakes aren't blunders and embarrassing, I really like games that give me the room to make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even something fun about, or maybe the most fun about, identifying a new mistake that you made.
Yep.
Right? Because I think that's something in Dune Imperium. The first time I played it, I didn't know very much, but now that I know the mechanism better, I think next time it would start clicking for me. It's like, oh, like I now am, when I make a mistake, like I'll be better able to like perceive it as such, right? And that is like, there's no more key to learning than being like, I didn't even realize I was making this mistake. And now that I've learned that, I can adjust it. I can stop making it. Definitely. I feel like that in disc golf all the time. I'm like, just learning how to throw a disc correctly. You start out watching the tip videos and everything, and you just have to like keep practicing and practicing. And now, after playing intensively for a year, if I go back and look at the same videos, like I understand them completely differently because of how many times I've been through that motion and just becoming more in tune with executing on that. it's pretty. It's just, it's kind of blown my mind revisiting some of those lately. I'm just like, oh wow, like that's what they mean.
Yeah. I feel like this charts so interestingly on the decisions and choices dichotomy that we were talking about too, Jake, because within the sort of learning curve that we're talking about caused by mistakes, charted onto that, I think baseline heuristics sometimes in games help you realize all of the choices that a game gives you that aren't really choices. So when you first sit down to play a game, you might know that you might just see all of the choices and say, okay, these are all decisions I can make. Very quickly, those heuristics might, lop off half of those choices, and then you see the real decisions. And then you are ignoring some of the choices that you can make. And through mistakes, maybe you start to ignore more and start to ignore more. And I feel like expert play can then get you back into sort of seeing when a choice that to everyone else at the table seems like an unviable choice, an option within the game that is foolish to take. Expert play sometimes can be knowing when those really low probability or low, not oftenly effective choices actually are a viable decision and making that happen. And I think sometimes that's where players get to the point where they're sort of saying like, oh, like there's room for expression in this game because you've identified its point where everyone at the table doesn't see how this specific choice is actually a decision you can make, and then it pays off. That can be even more exciting and can sort of lead to mastery. But there's so many mistakes sort of on the road to seeing a game state that makes that true.
Yeah, I think that what you did was just kind of put together a really great framework for entry level play, which is all about making the fewest mistakes, taking the fewest actions that are not actually viable at the table. Where expert level play is all about inaccuracies, right?
Yeah.
And that's how I feel when I play Castles of Burgundy. A game I've played 50 plus times last year alone on Yukata. I feel like at this point of that game, I'm not making mistakes on my turn. I'm just trying to find the optimal, very best play on my turn. And, against a new player, I'm going to win the vast majority of those games because if they make, one or two not viable moves, I'll be so far ahead of them. And, I'd love to have a Castle of Burgundy play algorithm to see. That'd be pretty cool.
That would be super cool.
Get on it, nerds!
So I think this discussion has been really productive, Jake. And you brought up earlier that you feel like mistakes are fundamental to games. So then I, just for the sake of the conversation, want to pose the question, can you have a game that does not allow players to make mistakes? Or is that an activity or a toy? Is it possible to have a sort of an experience that doesn't allow you to make mistakes? And then if that's the case, are mistakes a fundamental aspect of games?
I don't think that it's possible for there to be a game that doesn't allow you to make mistakes. I think that gets us really close to red versus blue. Mm-hmm. That said, I do think that it's a matter of scale, right? And I think one thing about when you talk about point salad games, those are games where everything you do is good. Everything you do is getting you points in some ways. In Castles of Burgundy, you can't take anything, you can't do anything in that game that does not help you, that does not give you points. But there are clearly things that give you more points or less points, right? And in the same way that you could blender away a queen, choosing a move that gives you the potential to earn 2 points in Castles of Burgundy over a move that gives you the potential to earn 20 points is essentially the same thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like I was completely on board with you. And then you said, bless you. Then you said the red versus blue example. And then I thought, well, I think red versus blue is a game, but it's not a game I'm very interested in playing.
I guess does it come down to your definition of like, what is a game?
I think it probably does, which probably is not a great, that's not great waters to wade into at this point in the conversation. But I will say, I think mistakes are key to strategy games. That those two things are obviously inexorably tied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea that we just get more and more abstract in every single episode. It's like an art project. So like we start out like, what is decision space? And then we're like, wait, like we don't even know what a game is. Like, what is a game? And then we're like, what is?
This is just going to turn into a linguistics podcast.
Yeah.
But I guess, do you sort of, this is an interesting sort of podcast and conversation today, Jake. And I feel like more so, I feel like I've been equipped with the language to understand, like, when I make a mistake in a game, what type of mistake I've made. And I think I'll also maybe be a little bit more aware of, like, when I'm reflecting on playing board games, like, oh, was that decision an inaccuracy? In terms of looking for an edge. And sometimes, you know, you can win games and realize when you have inaccuracies or even mistakes also. But do you have any takeaways in terms of the conversation?
I think that's really interesting. And I think perhaps the most fruitful thing we've done is think about how that chess framework can be applied to games. I think, you know, I do think that would be helpful. And especially in one of my favorite thing about games in general in this hobby is after the game, if people are willing to like sit around and kind of like talk about what just happened. Had a really fantastic talk. You know, our game of Dune Imperium, I think, was, you know, 90 minutes, and then we'd probably talked for 20 minutes after about the design, the game, you know, what happened, and that was as much fun as playing the game itself. And I think, you know, if you had a group of friends that were equipped with this framework, especially if somebody's more experienced in the game with you and you want to learn, I think this could be a really helpful way to just have a more nuanced conversation about the play and kind of what went down, as opposed to saying like, this was a mistake. You know, you say like, this was, you know, a blunder and here's why, or this was, you know, not your best move. You know, it was a very good move, but if I was in your situation, I might have thought about doing this instead. And I think that's I think that's helpful, especially, you know, just for learning and increasing our understanding of some of these games.
Definitely. Well put, Jake. I feel like for me, I feel like one thing that I really want to take forward is how succinctly you put the execution error of bandwidth overload being a bridge in some ways between how we experience games and how we experience sports and other sort of, and it's where execution plays more of a role, and sort of thinking through that and making sure to bring that into our conversation on the decision spaces of games. Because I think we've sort of waded into it a little bit at times, but there's probably even more of an opportunity to take this idea of making mistakes and what type of mistake there is and what that says about the decision space, given the size of it, even in terms of the viable decisions that you have or the choices that it presents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking through in the future as we talk about games, like what kind of mistakes are happening, what mistakes are we noticing in our plays, might be something really interesting to elevate and provide a more complete picture of what it's like to play that game. I think, you know, it's another thing that we're continuing to flesh out that's important, not necessarily impacting the decisions, right? The decision space itself, but certainly the tenor of the decision space and like what it feels to exist there.
Definitely. So a few of y'all in our Discord said you should do an episode on decisions versus choices, now that you mentioned that in the last episode on Carcassonne. So I would like to hear from you, or if you would like to come to the Discord and give us that opinion yourself. Do you think that this episode has fulfilled that role for you? Or would you like to hear further discussion of it? And if so, what direction would you like to see Jake and I take it?
That would be really interesting. And I think also just for further thoughts, I'd be interesting what people have to say about how this impacts game design. Are designers thinking about the types of mistakes people are likely to make in the game and the experience of that, right? Because I think, you know, we talk about how painful these bandwidth mistakes are. You know, are people thinking about eliminating that? Are people thinking about the number of turns between, or the amount of time between a mistake being made and when feedback is given, how feedback was given, you know, in a way to facilitate learning? I think there's a lot of kind of rich stuff there for the game designers out there. If you're a game designer, is that something you think about with your design, your work?
Definitely. Can I quickly give an Enchanted Plumes anecdote? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Jake.
of course. I mean, I guess if you're a game designer on this podcast, you can share your thoughts now.
Enchanted Plumes is a game that I designed, and it has since been published. And the experience of watching people make mistakes, but not knowing that they're making mistakes, so making a choice that they feel is a decision, I think is simultaneously one of the most painful and also exciting things on being on the other side of the table, because you just sort of see the potential for learning to play out. And I try so hard not to sort of point it out in situations like that too, because I just want people to be able to make the dang decision that they want to make and to have it feel that way. And eventually they'll see like, oh, maybe sticking a 4 in the base of my peacock is a bad idea, or a 5, depending on player count. But it's so fun. Sort of, I think that before designing Enchanted Plumes, I didn't think like, oh, what are the room that players can make mistakes in, beyond sort of saying I wanted players to have agency over how their turns played out. That's where like, start as many peacocks as you want. I don't care. If you want to try to start 8 of them, yeah, that'll be a mistake. But I wanted players to be able to do that because it created, I thought, more of a decision space that players could sort of push against and explore. But beyond that, I didn't think much about mistakes. And I'm kind of glad that I didn't think more about mistakes, because I think I think at that point in time, I might have been more likely to say, oh, there's too much room to make mistakes, and sort of pulled back and sort of maybe tried to guide people in the rules even or something. And mistakes are good. Let people make them.
I think at a very surface level, like the fact that people are making mistakes when playing a game tells you that that game is functioning as a game.
Yeah, there's strategic depth. Yeah.
There's like, that's like, you gotta have that. And I think now we're back to square one.
So basically what the final takeaway is that when you're playtesting a game designer's game and they're smiling at you, be wary about the choices you're making, the decisions you're making, because maybe they're choices and you're just making them feel good about the mistakes you're making, proving
they're just sitting there like, I got you with that one.
Yeah, exactly. But I think with that's a nice little cap on our episode here today, Jake. But do you have any closing thoughts or any wise words for the listeners about mistakes?
Try not to make them, but when you do, learn from them. And, at the end of the day, we're all here to play games and have a good time. So be tolerant of people who make mistakes when it happens. Be patient with yourself as well.
Definitely. And enjoy when mistakes happen that are memorable, because they'll shape how you play and remember games.
You know what? Actually, here's my final word. I want to shout out to the amazing game podcast, So Very Wrong About Games, and their co-host Mark, who said famously, I think it's fantastic, mistakes are interesting, so play faster.
Yeah, well said, Mark. With that, like I said, if you stop by the Discord, the link is in the show notes. Also, we've been posting on our blog every week on BGG. None of y'all have commented. Many of you all are thumbing up the post, which I really appreciate. It helps get Decision Space in front of more people. But if you decide to make the decision to comment, Jake and I will be thrilled, even if it's just like saying blurb or like potato, we'll just know. But for all you pre-planners out there who are still listening, Jake and I are not rewarding you this week. You just have to be left guessing. We
talked about a couple of games on this episode that potentially could come up.
Ooh.
Maybe Castles of Burgundy, maybe Hey, That's My Fish. I don't know.
Who knows? Also, we'll see you next time. Keyflower maybe on the horizon. Jake maybe even on the horizon. We'll see. We'll see if Jake wants to play Keyflower more.
Amazingly, we haven't exhausted all the games yet.
And let's hope we never do.
Thanks for listening. We so appreciate it.
Take care, y'all.
You are now exiting the Decision Space. Thanks for listening.
Please take care and enjoy the rest of your game.